Okay, so I've spent most of the last year in the 18th century and produced a book that just came out today, and I'm going to tell you about it. Some books really are all heart, and my book isn't that. And some books are all head, and this particular book isn't that. So what I think I will do is start with heart, and then do head, and then we'll kind of be in the middle. Here's the origin of this book. So with your indulgence, I'm going to read for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about the Constitution. A few months ago, I moved from New York to Massachusetts. My wife, who's in the house, Samantha Power, and I chose to live in Concord, though we're not working there. This wasn't a practical decision. Concord is beautiful. It's also historic. It's where the Revolutionary War started on April 19, 1775, when 700 British soldiers were given what they thought were secret orders to destroy colonial military supplies being held in Concord. That's where Paul Revere rode, where dozens of colonists fought and died, and dozens were badly hurt, and when our national experiment started. Do you know the phrase, "the shot heard round the world"? If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said with 100% confidence that it referred to Bobby Thompson's game-winning home run in 1951, which won the pennant for the New York Giants. Wrong answer. The phrase is a lot older than that. Here's Concord Hymn, written in 1836 by Concord's Ralph Waldo Emerson for the dedication of the obelisk, a monument commemorating the Battle of Concord. Focus, if you would, on the fourth line, though I confess it's the third that really gets to me. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone that memory may their deem redeem when, like our sires, our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. Emerson wrote that 61 years after the event. No single shot is known to have started the American Revolution, but it was in Concord that British soldiers confronted the American militia on North Bridge. And I'm going to show you a representation that is super accurate, according to the contemporaneous observers. The Americans were under strict orders not to shoot unless the British shot first. There are the Americans on the far side. There's the British. You notice the British look really professional. They were. The Americans are farmers. The British started by firing 2 or 3 shots into the Concord River. This is from the statements of people who were there at the time. The Americans thought that those were just warnings. You know, the British were there family members, basically, and the idea they'd actually shoot at them, that was not expected. The Americans stood by, thinking that they're trying to disperse us, we're not going to go, it's going to all stand down in a moment. This is they're trying to get the munitions, we're not going to let them, it's going to end there. But the British followed basically 45 seconds later with a volley by which they killed 2 Americans. They killed a fifer who was in his teens, and they shot in the heart by luck one of the 2 American military men who were there, who weren't real farmers. Captain Isaac Davis, killed, murdered, the first American to die in the Revolution, and he left a widow and 4 kids. The other military guy was named John Buttrick, a leader of the Concord militia, and he leapt from the ground and exclaimed, and everyone who was there said these are his exact words, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." What gets to me about that, I confess, is fellow soldiers, they were farmers. They weren't soldiers until that moment. And for God's sake, it's pretty extreme talk. He knew their lives were on the line. They were about to get massacred. According to those who were there, the word fire ran like electricity through the whole line of Americans. And for a few seconds, the words fire, fire were heard from hundreds of mouths. Acting as one, Concord's embattled farmers, and you can see them on the other side, followed Buttrick's order. They shot. That was the famous shot, the first battle in which Americans defended themselves. 2 of the British soldiers were killed. The rest ran off. To their astonishment, the Americans won the initial engagement, and the war was on. To Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and their peers, Revolutionary Concord was not history, it was fresh. It was where their friends and colleagues fought, and it was where some of them died. Having settled on Concord, my wife and I had to decide upon possible houses. For us, our 2 young kids, and the puppy we would soon get, a yellow Labrador retriever, whose name, of course, is Snow. There were 2 house finalists. The first had been completed just a few months before we visited. Gorgeous, sunlit, shining, functional, clean, perfect, with a new air conditioning system, a kitchen to die for, and all the modern amenities. No one could avoid loving it. The second finalist was built in 1763 by an active participant in the American Revolution named Ephraim Wood, Jr. In 1771, before the Revolution, Wood was chosen as one of Concord's selectmen, town clerks, and assessor and overseer of the poor. He was reelected to those offices 17 times. According to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, the Wood House is among the most important of Concord's early farmhouses. The reason is it played a big role in the Revolutionary War. It was one of the few places that the British fighting forces went when they were trying to get rid of the American, munitions, and that's because it held some of the munitions. Wood detected them. He saw them coming. He got the munitions out, and he took them over a little river right near the Wood House, as it's called. The house was saved because a British spy who was a neighbor lied to the British troops and said Ephraim Wood is not involved in munitions holding. Okay, as the fighting started, got terrible, and then worse, the house remained intact. It was there before the U.S. was a country, and it was there when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was there when the Articles of Confederation ruled the land. It was there when the Federalist Papers were written and when the Constitution was ratified. But in the 21st century, a few months ago, no one wanted to buy the house. The reason you can probably imagine, it's not perfect. Its 18th century origins show if you're over 5'2", it's hard to get in the front door. It's low. There's a pony barn in back, which no self-respecting pony would live in. Upstairs, the floors tilt. They're like that. You feel as if you're dizzy or in a fun house. The master bedrooms seem built for people really who were under 5 feet tall. Of course, the house didn't have air conditioning. The basement was a mess filled with crazy wires from various decades. We were interested in it still, and we asked an architect who lives right near here to visit and give us an evaluation. After he did, we looked at him expectantly, and he was basically... He didn't have a nice word to say about that house. But still, whenever you enter the front door and bend down, you know that you are where the revolution started, where Americans hid arms ready to fight for their liberty, and where they felt a spirit that, quote, made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free. I am one of those children. Reader, I bought it. Okay. That's the heart of the book. It actually has everything to do with impeachment. Okay, what I've learned over the past year is that something happened between 1750 and 1776, which makes the American Revolution deserve to belong with the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution for earth-shatteringness. The American Revolution is often described as a kind of modest, within the family geographical split. We are, after all, speaking often of Anglo-American law. The American Revolution doesn't look like it did anything major in terms of politics or culture. That's entirely wrong. Our nation and its exceptionalism, ultimately defined, I think, by the Impeachment Clause, is captured by the fact that in the pre-1750 period, common people were made to recognize and feel their subordination to gentlemen so that they developed a down look. They willingly walked while gentlefolk rode, and they seldom expressed any desire to change places with their betters. So this is just a way of saying that the American colonies were a culturally monarchical, hierarchical regime in which people knew their place. And that was part of self-understanding. Ordinary people accepted their own loneliness. Okay, there was a radical revolution in this period in which republicanism was on the march, and republicanism denied the intrinsic superior of any human being to another human being. The idea of a down look was extinguished in the period. And that meant that everyone in this room and anyone you see out in Cambridge or anyone you see in terrible areas of our country, ultimately, consistent with the march of republicanism, has equal dignity. And this was something which was a fire in the decades, such that people said, we were once subjects, we're now citizens. We see through different eyes, hear through different ears. Everything changed. In such a short time, the relationship to people with one another and the relationship between people with their government had never been turned upside down so quickly. I had the great good fortune to clerk for Justice Thurgood Marshall, who told me one day about an encounter he had with Prince Philip when he was just a lawyer. And he shook hands with Prince Philip, and Philip, after that, looked at Marshall and said in the most posh British accent, "Would you like to know what I think of lawyers?" To which Marshall responded, "Would you like to know what I think of princes?" And Marshall was completely tracking what happened in the 18th century in America. Americans didn't like princes very much. Bob Dylan, Nobel laureate, said sometimes even the President of the United States has to stand naked. That's really American talk. And I just learned, because I'm kind of a Bob Dylan fan, that when he was in England, he was under terrible fire for having abandoned folk music in favor of songs like a Rolling Stone, which is an American anthem, by the way, about the equality of persons. And he was asked, what kind of music is this? And Dylan's answer was, it's American music. He was recalling something unleashed in the culture in the 18th century. The civil rights movement and the women's movement were born, I'm suggesting, in what was on the march in Concord in the 1770s. So here are a few passages that are just representative. John Adams wrote with astonishment, "Idolatry to monarchs and servility to aristocratical pride were never so erratically eradicated from many minds in so short a time." David Ramsay, who was actually captured by the British and was one of the first soldiers, said, "Subjects look up to a master, but citizens are so far equal that none have hereditary rights superior to others." And Thomas Paine was the one who said, "Our style and manner of thinking have undergone a revolution more extraordinary than the political revolution of a country." Okay, now what I want to tell you about is the Americanization of impeachment. And this is a tale that is not known even among specialists in impeachment. It took me a lot of really boring and obsessive labor to uncover it. Okay, so Raoul Berger, who actually lived in Concord, Harvard professor, and I think the greatest historian of impeachment, he missed something. What he got was impeachment and the idea of high crimes and misdemeanors. These are imports from England. But what he missed was in the period in which impeachment was born in America, it was gone in England. It wasn't being used much. And Americans started doing it, to the extent that John Adams, before we had a country, described impeachment as one of the primary liberties of English men. Impeachment, one of the primary liberties. And the background against Adams was speaking was the real first shots fired in the American Revolution were not guns, they were impeachment proceedings, in which in the colonies, the Americans, not quite that yet, but that was their self-understanding, were impeaching British authorities for following the orders of the Crown. They deemed that an egregious abuse of authority because it was liberty restricting, and they called it a high crime and misdemeanor. What happened in this period during the seeing through other eyes, no more down looks, was Americans started impeaching authorities, creating a kind of homegrown mechanism which resulted in extremely insubordinate acts on the part of the colonists against people who were following the king. Okay, after the Revolution, the states started putting impeachment clauses in their own constitutions. It's all over the early state constitutions. Not only was it technically recognized, there was a train of practice, and the practice was not unclear. It was people were being impeached if they egregiously abused the authority they had, either by violating people's liberties or by grossly exceeding the legal authority they had. So there's a period of constitution-free United States of America and constitution-pervaded states of America in which impeachment is an embodied practice. But what about the executive? At the national level, there isn't one. That's not amazing. The idea of a king was kind of public enemy number one, such that the post-revolutionary America ran like the plague away from anything that would be reminiscent of that. Okay, so here's a tale. You may have heard it. This is my favorite version. There's a woman named Mrs. Powell who said to Benjamin Franklin after Philadelphia Convention produced something, said, "Well, doctor, what have we got?" Franklin, by the way, 81 years old, said, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" That's the precise formulation. That's the right question. And Franklin's answer was, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And a Republican has to give that answer, yes? Has to have the last few words. Because if you're committed to self-government and the equal dignity of human beings, you cannot say, "We have given you a republic." That would defy everything. But, and there's the but, that's George Washington. And he became president. And we take that as not a but at the time, it was a big but, meaning a president who has the kind of authority that Article 2 provides is reminiscent of what the revolution was fought for and what people died in Concord to prevent. That is a single person with potentially tyrannical authority. Okay, Alexander Hamilton of the play won a smashing victory at the Constitutional Convention, which is to create a unitary executive. There was a battle of the Titans at the convention in which some people who were deeply respected, fought in the Revolutionary War, were learned, said this is terrible. And you're seeing three of them. Edmund Randolph said the unitary executive would be the fetus of monarchy. And those aren't just words. Those are exclamations of risk. The words from Hugh Williamson were that the nation is going to have an elective king. John Dickinson, who was a little bit lost to history, was one of the greatest thinkers and statesmen of the time, one of the most respected from Philadelphia. And Dickinson said that Wilson, who was on Hamilton's side, that would produce an executive not consistent with a republic and more akin to what happened in Great Britain. Dickinson went for the jugular there, and no one missed what he was doing. Okay. Nonetheless, Hamilton won. The idea was a modern nation, at the time, could not operate without a single powerful executive. Debate number one, should there be impeachment? And it was argued that there shouldn't be by a minority, saying that it would be inconsistent with the separation of powers, that if the Congress can get rid of the president, then there's too much interdependence, and that's no good. Okay, here's the argument that carried the day. And it's probably worth pausing over every one of these fraught sentences. And what's astounding to see is in these debates, the revolution is fresh. The Concord battle is known to be the beginning of it all. The number of issues being resolved in a short time is fantastic. And yet the degree of clarity and attention given to almost every one is, almost beyond belief. Here's the argument given. No point is of more importance than that the right of impeachment should be continued. Pause over that sentence, should you? Can you? That's not meant as rhetoric. Nothing we're doing is more important than this. Shall any man be above justice? Above all, shall that man be above it who can commit the most extensive injustice. And this you can think of as Dickinson's revenge in the convention against his defeat at Hamilton's hands. These are not Dickinson's words, but it's Dickinson's music. Shall the man who has practiced corruption, and by that means procured his appoint in the first instance, be suffered to escape punishment by repeating his guilt? Meaning there, you procure your presidency by corrupt means, and then can you do evil things and continue in office? Okay, my view is that the impeachment provision is a sine qua non for the Constitution. Without it, we wouldn't have had one. And the kind of defining document for those who are saying things like this is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, if you read it in light of the period, it's articles of impeachment. That's what it is. Okay, the second big debate is on what grounds shall the president be impeachable? And there was very brisk exchange of drafts that had radically different terms. And this is foundational stuff. It was only late that the issue was resolved. A late draft said the president is impeachable for treason and bribery. That's it. That's all. Mason urged, you've got to be kidding. Treason as defined in the Constitution will not reach many great and dangerous offenses. And please pause, if you would, over great and dangerous offenses. Hastings, someone who Edmund Burke was trying to get impeached, was not guilty of treason. He acted lawlessly, but not treason. Attempts to subvert the Constitution may not be treason within the meaning of the Constitution. As bills of attainder are forbidden, it's more necessary to extend the powers of impeachment. So bills of attainder are basically prosecutions of officials by the legislature. That was thought to be inconsistent with due process. So we need a broader conception of impeachment. He moved to add after bribery or maladministration. Okay, that's a very dramatic moment. Madison, who spoke, it sounds like, off the page very quietly, but decisively, said, so vague a term will be equivalent to a tenure during pleasure of the Senate. And then Morris, who's going back and forth, said, don't worry about it. Every four-year election will prevent maladministration. Mason withdraws maladministration and substitutes other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's it. High crimes and misdemeanors is the cavalry. It rescues an extremely difficult situation, which is definition. Now, I think the core of this debate, what makes it highly illuminating, is that Mason wanted to reach great and dangerous offenses. That was his goal. He acknowledged Madison's point that maladministration's too broad, and he himself used high crimes and misdemeanors, evidently thinking that great and dangerous offenses were sufficiently picked up by that term. Okay, what happened in ratification? Well, here are, in my view, the four highlights of, maybe 600 or so illuminating remarks. Highlight number one, Hamilton, the fan of presidential power, says that what we're speaking of is the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to society itself. Hamilton was never casual with words, at least in the Federalist Papers and in the constitutional debates, like the musical gets that right. He wasn't casual with words. And that suggests that a crime is neither necessary nor sufficient. Meaning, if the president shoplifts or refuses to pay his income taxes, we're not in the domain of the impeachable offense. But a crime is not necessary either. If the president says black lives don't matter and I'm going to impeach any police officer who's killed a person of color, that's impeachable in a heartbeat, even though it's not a crime. If there's any ambiguity about that, the Virginia ratifying debate nails it. One of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence, who was at the Constitutional Convention and refused to sign the document, urged in the all-important Virginia ratifying convention, you guys, we can't do this. The reason is the pardon power. What was urged was the pardon power is so expansive, the president can plot with one of his advisors to do something terrible, then the advisor is subject to criminal investigation, and then the president can pardon that person. This is not a constitution for us. And it's a very strong argument, yes, made by someone who was both highly respected and acute. Madison's response, very, very quiet. It reads on the page almost like a whisper. He said, "The gentleman seems to have overlooked something." And Madison said, if the president shelters someone who's done something terrible via the pardon power, we have a remedy for that. It's impeachment. And Madison urged, actually, a broader account of what impeachment would attach to through exercise of the pardon power than his questioner raised by talking about the president counseling crimes. He said, you should shelter someone, impeachable. Okay, so there's Hamilton and Madison, maybe our two best authorities on constitutional meaning, but there are two others that are pretty good. Here in Massachusetts, even before Harvard Law School existed, one of the ratifying debaters said, "Thus we see that no office, however exalted, can protect the miscreant who dares invade the liberties of his country, or countenance in his crimes the impious villain who sacrilegiously attempts to trample upon the rights of free men." Okay, if I had to have one passage that captured what the ratifiers thought were the grounds for impeachment, that's the one I would single out, because it tightly connects the impeachment clause with what the revolution was fought for and calls up unambiguously the concerns who thought we're going back to the monarchy here. James Iredell, a very respected authority, said that the president could be impeached for being a villain. That's probably imprecise. But then added, a president must certainly be impeachable for giving false information to the Senate. Now that suggests that a certain degree of, what's the right word, probity was thought to be necessary. Okay, let's talk a little bit about easy cases. President likes police officers. He announces that if any police officer is accused of murder or assault, he will exercise the pardon power and pardon the officer in full. impeachable. That's right in the Virginia ratifying convention. He may not have committed a crime, but he's abused distinctly presidential powers in an egregious manner. A president was elected as a result of a secret plan with, let's say, Syria. As part of that plan, the president worked closely and personally with leaders of that nation to disseminate false information about a political opponent. Clearly impeachable. That goes right to the territory of the debates at the convention. A president issues an executive order requiring his EPA to issue unlawful regulations. The Supreme Court unanimously strikes down the regulations. Not impeachable. The president is allowed to act on the basis of a legal judgment that turns out to be wrong. Every president has. The president, after a terrorist attacks, issues executive orders designed to combat terrorism. Traveling in airports or railroad stations is really tough, let's imagine. And let's suppose also some of those are invalidated in court on constitutional grounds. That's also easy. We're not talking here of the kinds of things that Madison, Hamilton, and others were concerned about. Okay, here's some hard cases. Erratic decisions which are causing domestic and international turmoil. The economy is collapsing. The world is super dangerous. The president is not incompetent. It's just his judgment is so terrible that there's a bipartisan consensus that he needs to go based on the specific decisions which are misdemeanors, bad acts in their understanding. That's actually a hard one. It's not like what Hamilton and Madison and the convention was talking about. I have an institutional suggestion there that in a really hard case about the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors, the process solution is the right one. The House of Representatives gets to resolve it however it sees fit. It's a gap case. Another gap case is one in which the president is lying all the time about foreign policy, budget, taxes. It's not spinning, it's just falsehoods. We have to be very careful here because presidential statements that turn out to be false are frequent in any administration in a year, at least arguably inconsistent with the truth. But we could imagine a case that would be sufficiently patterned that the debates in the ratifying conventions and Iredell's comments in particular would trigger a legitimate impeachment remedy. Okay, let's give a couple of cases and then we'll go back to the beating heart of this topic. President Nixon was legitimately impeached. Some of the articles of impeachment for him were shaky or not clearly sufficient. But one of the articles said he misused the apparatus of the government to punish people who didn't agree with him politically. There's a tight link between that article of impeachment and what was said in Massachusetts. Use of presidential authority to target political enemies, that's a high crime and misdemeanor within the meaning of the clause. Clinton, as kind of squirm-producing or worse as this photograph and those events are, not close to the line of the impeachable. And the reason is what the President Clinton's articles complained of were two things: perjury and obstruction of justice, both in connection with the Paula Jones case. Perjury, lying about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Obstruction of justice, encouraging her and other people to lie about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, basically. Perjury, obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice and perjury are not necessarily impeachable if they don't involve something like what called up the impeachment clause. And there's actually a smoking gun in the founding period in which it's urged that conduct that the president can do that is the same conduct that people who aren't president can do, it's not impeachable. It's subject to some other process, maybe after he's not president anymore. But the suggestion is that this conduct, however awful, is not the kind of conduct that triggers impeachment. So that was an unconstitutional impeachment. Okay, and the Andrew Johnson impeachment was done because Andrew Johnson fired as Secretary of War in violation of a statute that prohibited him from firing the Secretary of War, and added the very statute firing the Secretary of War is a high crime and misdemeanor. The statute actually said that. But saying so doesn't make it so. And President Johnson had a good faith argument that the impeachment was, that the discharge was legally permissible. And it turned out decades later that the unanimous Supreme Court said that the argument was correct. And recall that errors with respect to law, if they stem from a good faith view of what the law means, that's not an impeachable offense. So that was unconstitutional too. Okay, there's Mussolini, and that's a good slide to focus on as the category of the plainly impeachable violations of civil liberties. Okay, just a few last words, and forgive they're going to start with a personal quality. When I was growing up in Waban, Massachusetts, about half an hour from here, my family celebrated 4 holidays: Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, and the 4th of July. For a kid, Christmas and Easter are the most fun, yes, but even for a kid, Thanksgiving and the 4th of July can be the most meaningful. In school, first grade, I think, it was imprinted on us that during the Revolutionary War, Americans celebrated Thanksgiving too. Amazing, yes? They had that holiday then. In 1777, before we were a country, the Continental Congress issued the first national proclamation of Thanksgiving. And a little over a year later, George Washington established the first Thanksgiving Day for the country under the new Constitution. I didn't know that level of detail, but I did know something joyful about George Washington. First in peace, first in war, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. To yours truly, and maybe to many people in this room, the 4th of July is the perfect bookend to Thanksgiving Day. Yes, you can think of it that way. My dad, a naval lieutenant, fought in the Philippines during World War II. The fighting there was brutal. Maybe it was the worst fighting in the war. It was apparently astonishingly harsh. And my dad was nearly killed twice. His most harrowing tale, he was driving a car through a remote area in the Philippines, and he spotted, forgive me, a Japanese sniper aiming at him, taking direct aim. He kneeled down as he drove, put his hand on the steering wheel, bent down, couldn't see anything, got shot at, but none of the shots hit him, and he made it through. My dad wasn't sentimental, but the nation's birthday meant everything to him. At ball games, he always stood up for the national anthem, and when he did that, he put his hand on his heart. But it was my mother who told me about Jefferson and some declaration he had written. Thank goodness the holiday was mostly about ice cream and tennis, not dead people and declarations. But on the day itself, the old text is everywhere, and back then, as now, I think, gosh, doesn't it seem like a prayer? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Reading the Declaration today, I, for one, am astounded. It consists of grievances against the present King of Great Britain, whose history is one of injuries and usurpations, having in direct object the establishment of tyranny. It's articles of impeachment. A flavor? 1, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. 2, he has made judges dependent on his will alone. 3, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass other laws to encourage their migrations hither. Like Justice Marshall, the authors of the Declaration really did not like monarchs. A prince whose character is marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. They closed with this pledge, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They acted in accordance with that pledge. 9 of the 56 signatories died in battle. That's a high percentage, yes? 2 of them lost their children in battle. The homes of at least a dozen were pillaged and burned. On Thanksgiving and every other day, Americans have a ton to be thankful for. The Star-Spangled Banner yet waves. The Declaration is going to celebrate its 250th anniversary before long. We've had no tyrants, in part because of the constitutional design. The document that Madison, Hamilton, and their colleagues created has been improved by amendments, but most of their choices are there, just as they made them. Sure, we could tell tales of oppression, cruelty, and betrayal. It took a civil war to abolish slavery. Until 1920, women could be forbidden from voting. Freedom of speech, amazingly, didn't flower until the 1960s. But the hardest-won victories are a product of the American Revolution itself, a revolution that put a principle of equal dignity at the center of national aspirations. By the way, if we want to know what American exceptionalism is, it's not what President Obama says, the capacity for self-reinvention. It's not what the Republican Party has been saying, which is something about flag waving, and it's self-government and the equal dignity of human beings. That's American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism. When the Revolution overthrew a king and when the Constitution prohibited titles of nobility, they reflected a set of commitments that continue to ignite fires. Martin Luther King, in defense of the Civil Rights Revolution, said, "If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong." More fires are coming. The power of impeachment provides a unique window onto our republic. In the 18th century or the 21st, no big country can flourish without executive authority. Hamilton was right. At the same time, the executive is by far, as Hamilton's critics insisted, the most dangerous of the 3 branches because it can do so much for good or for evil in such short a time. As the framing generation saw, there are really close links among the powerful presidency, the 4-year term, electoral control, and the power of impeachment. You can't allow the first without the latter 3. Echoing Benjamin Franklin's plea, Harvard Law School's own Justice Brandeis, failing, but attempting to vindicate the freedom of speech in dissent, warned that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. If the American constitutional system is working well or well enough, we the people get to cast our votes and love our families and live our lives. We don't need to focus on the impeachment mechanism. But if we're going to keep our republic, we do need to know about it. It's our fail-safe, our sword, our shield, our ultimate weapon for self-defense. Actually, it's a lot more than that. It's a symbol and a reminder of who is really in charge and where sovereignty resides. As much as any provision of our founding document, it announces that Americans are citizens, not subjects. It connects each and every citizen, everyone in this room, and your parents, and your kids if you have them, and your neighbors. It connects everyone, even if your parents weren't born here, even if you weren't born here. It connects you to Concord's embattled farmers and those really tough, inspired days in the middle and late 1770s when an idea, republicanism, was literally on the march. Whenever Americans strike a blow against some form of tyranny, at a law school, in a corporate office, in a state house, with a letter, or a big blow through something more dramatic, we are honoring our nation's highest ideals and the people who are willing to live and die for them. Thanks.